since this discussion is not happening, sadly. Sai, what could we talk about? Could we talk about the Places of Worship Act, perhaps? Maybe we can understand that from you. Since tomorrow is Independence Day and we're stepping into a new year of this country.
Sure. Done.
So this is, okay, we are switching the debate from caste to Places of Worship Act and discussing how Kashi and Mathura in the future can be reclaimed legally. So somebody is saying, please say Jai Shri Ram before ending it. Why don't we just say Jai Shri Ram before starting it?
Yeah.
Jai Shri Ram. So tomorrow we enter a new year of independent India. And it's the first year of independent India where we've reclaimed one of our major religious sacred places, Ram Janmabhoomi. And the Bhumi Pujan has been done, and soon there's going to be a Bhavya Ram Mandir over there. But when you think about the Ram Janmabhoomi, you also automatically think about Kashi and Mathura and the thousands of temples which are still illegal structures that were built by the invaders. So one of the impediments, one of the problems in the reclamation of our civilization perhaps is the Places of Worship Act, which was enacted after the illegal structure which was there on Ram Janmabhoomi was demolished by Karsevaks.
Right.
So, Sai, could you just explain to us the context of the act before we get into discussion of the act itself?
So, the act which came out in 1991 effectively had the consequence of preventing initiation of any legal proceedings for reclamation of occupied religious sites. Okay. Now, the legislation in itself is not a very long legislation. It's a fairly short and crisp legislation. And the preamble of that particular legislation makes it abundantly clear that the position of occupation or possession as it existed in 1947 shall not be interfered with, and the religious character of any place of worship shall remain what it was on the date of independence or at the time of independence. Okay. And this particular legislation had one exception, which is Section 5, which effectively exempted the Ram Janmabhoomi proceedings as far as the application of the act is concerned, which is to say that the only holy site which could be reclaimed through legal proceedings under the Places of Worship Act was the Ram Janmabhoomi, and all of the places which were contested and whose occupation and ownership and title was contested would remain unchallenged thanks to the application of the act. Okay. Now, perhaps it was because the Ram Janmabhoomi movement had picked up steam in the mid-80s, and that there were proceedings which were pending before the Faizabad court at that stage, which were filed in 1950, in fact. 5 suits were filed, I think, and then subsequently transferred to the Allahabad High Court in 1989. So because there were pending legal proceedings with respect to the Ram Janmabhoomi, perhaps the government at that stage, Mr. Narasimha Rao's government, deemed it fit to effectively exempt the scope of application of the Places of Worship Act to the Ram Janmabhoomi, but leaving everything else completely covered by it. So today, if anybody wants to initiate similar proceedings with respect to Kashi, Mathura, or perhaps even the St. Thomas Mount Church in Tamil Nadu, in Chennai, or any number of institutions, because we commonly assume that it's only, let's say, temples occupied or holy sites occupied by one community. In fact, our sites have been occupied by multiple communities, including Portuguese who went about destroying a lot of temples and building churches in their place. And unfortunately, we still seem to be holding on to those places as churches as opposed to giving it back to the original owners of those places. Okay. So that is the actual effect. Now, what does this actually do? What is it that we can do about it? This is something that I've tried to think about. Frankly, again, there is a petition that is pending before the Supreme Court, which was filed, I think, this year, challenging the Places of Worship Act on grounds that it is unconstitutional. And I don't know what the government's position is in this particular regard, because the construction of the Ram Mandir has featured significantly in the political manifesto and election manifesto of the BJP for some time. But
Yeah.
for some reason, that particular candor and that particular position is fairly absent with respect to other places which are similarly placed as the Ram Janmabhoomi. There is no reference to Kashi, there is no reference to Mathura. In fact, my position is that you can't even limit yourself only to Kashi and Mathura, because if you read Dr. Sitaram Goel's book, Hindu Temples, What Happened to Them, he cites at least more than 7 temples in the first chapter. And in fact, the very first chapter of that particular book reproduces an article of Mr. Arun Shori, when I think he wrote it as part of Hindustan Times, where he identified at least 7 major institutions or 7 major temples which have been recorded by Islamic sources in their seminaries. For instance, I think he did some research on the books available in the Deoband seminary, and he came to the conclusion that the Arabic version of, let's say, the institution boldly makes the claim of destruction of non-Muslim places of worship. And by the time that particular version is translated to Urdu, there is a significant watering down of that particular claim. And by the time it translates to English, there is almost a whitewash that takes place between the Arabic version and the English version. And in fact, when the Ram Janmabhoomi proceedings were picking up steam, a lot of these original Arabic versions went missing from multiple libraries, is what he actually mentions as part of this chapter. Okay. So I believe that the Ram Janmabhoomi judgment is just one step in the right direction, but it's unfinished business.
No, but I want to understand when you talk about this act, which was enacted right after the illegal structure was demolished by Karsevaks, what really was the thought process that went into the enaction of this, the implementation of this act? Because essentially, you're telling Hindus through this act that if a place of worship which they hold sacred has been illegally occupied by invaders any number of years ago, they have no legal recourse in this country. So you're telling me that as a Hindu, I have absolutely no place else to turn. So, what was the thought process behind this, and what was the assumption as to how there would be no protest or no litigation or no challenge to this act?
So you see, let's get the timelines right, Nupur. The day on which the act is actually enacted, in fact, I have it right in front of me, is the 18th of September 1991, which is before the
Right,
demolition of the
right,
disputed structure.
before the demolition. Right.
Okay.
This was when the litigation was on in the Babri case.
Exactly. And in fact, Section 1 of the Act goes on to say that some portions of the Act and some provisions of the Act would have been deemed to come into force on the 11th of July 1991. So for all practical purposes, this particular Act and its critical provisions, so for instance, Section 3 is the one that contains the bar on conversion of places of worship or the character of the place of worship. That is deemed to have been in force since the 11th of July 1991. Okay, that's one. Second, the critical provision also is Section 7, which says that this particular legislation shall override and prevail over all other legislations in the country. Okay, so therefore, any right that you may have under any law other than the Places of Worship Act is deemed to have been overridden entirely by this particular legislation. Okay.
So essentially,
legally,
you are taking away the right to practice religion of Hindus.
Correct. So, in fact, you have touched upon a very important strand of this particular discussion, and let me clarify this. Every time the Ram Janmabhoomi issue was discussed prior to the final verdict of the Supreme Court, and even during the course of the mediation proceedings, a lot of people were tempted to indulge in some kind of barter, saying that if you give up Ram Janmabhoomi, then we will not claim these sites. If you give up Ram
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt you. I'm going to be clear for the sake of our readers, because this was the first thing that struck me when Sai mentioned the book by Sitaram Goelji. In the very beginning portion of his book, in fact, the first few pages of his book, he had mentioned very categorically that Advani ji, am I right, Sai? Had basically said that if Muslims were ready to give up their right or their claim, sorry, not right, but their claim to the illegal structure which was there on Ram Janmabhoomi, then he would ensure that the politically they would give up the right and the fight for Kashi, Mathura, and other temples which had been demolished and illegal structures had been made on it by invaders. Right, Sai?
Yes.
Yeah, so to be clear, to clarify, that is the context that Sai is mentioning. And since we are on Op India, we can't really hide that, or I'm going to get beaten up. So please, Sai, continue.
So, unfortunately, it was not just one particular individual. I think it was a school of thought
It
which
was.
effectively decided to engage in these kind of negotiations. So, the first thing that I think people forget is that I can't effectively negotiate on behalf of my neighbor's house merely because I want my house to be reclaimed and I want to
Yeah.
secure its possession from an invader or an illegal occupier, so to speak. Okay. The one thing that the Ram Janmabhoomi judgment clearly recognizes is that principles of property ownership continue to apply with respect to each of these sites. Okay? And had it not been for the 1991 legislation, proceedings would have been initiated with respect to at least 1,000 different sites across the country on the same lines as the Ram Janmabhoomi. Now, what does that tell me? For every so for every site, there is an identified community which has the right of ownership and guardianship over that particular site because it amounts to property within the meaning of the law. Okay.
Okay.
So no third party can negotiate on behalf of the owner or can give up rights or forego on behalf of the owner, even if
Hmm.
it happens to be a political position. In fact, a political position has no basis in law because whatever statement any politician may have made in the past does not bind members of the community and certainly does not bind those people who are rightful claimants and owners of that particular piece of property. Okay. So Krishna Janmabhoomi can only be argued upon. So the rest of the Hindu community can support the movement, but the rest of the Hindu community cannot give up on behalf of the owners. That is the distinction. As a Hindu and as someone who believes in Lord Krishna, I have the right to support those people who are fighting for reclamation of Sri Krishna Janmabhoomi. But as someone who is not a direct owner of that particular place or a direct stakeholder in that particular place, except for my rights under Article 25 to worship Lord Krishna, I have no right to strike a deal with a third party. Now, let me go a step further. Assume for a moment that members who are direct stakeholders and potential owners, so to speak, of these places, if they decide to give up those rights, then as members of the community and as devotees, we have the right to accuse them of having sacrificed our interests and we can take over the fight. Okay. So under no, what does all of this boil down to? The deity's rights and the deity's place must be protected by the members of the community. If the direct guardians of the deity and his institution and his abode sacrifice his rights, then the devotees have the legally guaranteed right to take over that particular fight and continue to fight for reclamation. That's the basic point.
Sai, there's a question here which pertains to the point you make. It says that one Ram Janmabhoomi lawyer on Lok Sabha TV stated that Article 13 of our Constitution gives the right to revive our religious places destroyed any number of years ago. So, Sai Deepak sir, please shed light on Article 13.
Article 13 effectively contains two caveats. One, that those laws which are inconsistent with the Constitution and especially with Part 3 of the Constitution and which predate the Constitution, so to speak, shall be deemed to have, how do I say, become infructuous. In fact, that is what Article 13(1) says. So let me just ensure that I'm not making a fool of myself so that we are very clear about this. Because one contains the definition, the other contains a caveat. So, correct. Laws inconsistent with or in derogation with fundamental rights. That's what it says. So, therefore, it could be argued that those laws, such as the Places of Worship Act, okay, can effectively be treated as being in derogation of fundamental rights because we have our rights under Article 25. However, Article 13 applies to only those laws which were in force immediately before the Constitution came into existence. Okay.
Okay.
So, if there were, let's say, 100 different laws which were applicable to the territory of India, And from the date of the coming into force of the Constitution, those laws which run counter to fundamental rights shall effectively be deemed to be void, so to speak. Okay, and they shall not have the force of law any further. Secondly, those laws which have been implemented or which have come into force after the coming into force of the Constitution, if you believe that a certain legislation violates your fundamental rights, then you have the right to challenge it in a court of law, and you have a right to prove why that particular legislation comes in the way of your enjoyment of your fundamental rights. Okay, so I don't agree with the Article 13 argument, because Article 13(1) specifically applies to legislations before the Constitution. The Places of Worship Act came into force on the 18th of September 1991, which is post the Constitution. So it needs to be the subject of challenge before a court, or the government, of course, has the right to repeal that particular legislation, which is always possible.
So, for the government to repeal the law, let's be honest, I think Ram Janmabhoomi, of course, was a very emotive issue which found resonance with a lot of Hindus across India, cutting across barriers and economic strata and social strata and all of that. Uh, what do you think? Now, I'm moving away from the legality of this for a little while. What do you think Hindus need to do to sort of make these issues a political rallying point? Because I think political parties, whether pro Hindu, anti Hindu, BJP, Congress, whichever party is in power, no issue is really going to turn into an emotive issue like the Ram Janma Bhoomi unless Hindus themselves turn the issue into an emotive one and a lucrative one for any political party as far as their politics is concerned.
Right.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but how, if that's true, then how do Hindus really pick this up and run with it, especially because the Places of Worship Act is in force, and any sort of movement as far as Krishna Janmabhoomi or our other temples are going to be merely noise, at least till that legislation is in force.
Right. See, I could be wrong, and there could be better people who are informed on the history of the Ram Janmabhoomi movement. But the Ram Janmabhoomi movement was primarily a people's movement which ultimately found resonance with political parties who understood that there was a fair degree of political incentive to be gained or mileage to be gained by supporting that particular movement. I am not saying that this was an opportunistic move. I am simply saying that there was a clear convergence between political interests and civilizational interests and ideology. Okay.
So because of
And
obviously these fights get messy, so you need public consensus and support when you're entering into a fight that is going to be this messy.
correct. And we are speaking of a time when perhaps the word Hindu itself was a cuss word. Okay, so in order for a political party to actually have the confidence to pick up an issue such as Ram Janmabhoomi, the issue itself should have attained a fair degree of critical mass or traction among members of the public and, let's say, Ram devotees, so to speak. So the credit, first of all, goes to non-political organizations and, let's say, the sadhus and the sannyasis and the devotees who kept the issue alive for close to 500 years before it turned into a movement that we refer to as today. Okay. So the issue was always alive. It was never on the back burner as far as the immediate stakeholders are concerned. So if you look at the representation of this particular movement by members of the left and those who believe in warped notions of secularism, they believe that until the BJP entered the particular this fray, nobody had any interest in it, and people did not care for this particular issue. But when the BJP started whipping up passions, citing the Ram Janmabhoomi, effectively this became a live issue. That is ahistoric. That is not the fact. The fact remains that for and this is something that the Supreme Court has recorded, that from Niham 6 to everyone, they continued to fight for this particular institution, preventing enjoyment and peaceful access of that particular place by the other community. And subsequently, of course, it became a mass movement because the VHP decided that the pace at which this particular matter was being decided was not sufficient. And therefore, a certain amount of public pressure needs to be created. Now, what is it that we can learn from that particular movement today? One, the 1980s and the 1990s are not the same as 2020. You live in the age of, let's say, Netflix. You live in the age of leftism, which has become popular even more in campuses. It was impossible for people to think of, let's say, Bharat Tere Tukde Honge slogans to be shouted on campuses in Delhi previously, but now it has become possible. So, in some say, let's say, on some fronts, the situation is better, and on some fronts, it has become absolutely worse. So, what is it that you can do? The first thing that I think the Ram Janmabhoomi has done is to tell us the power of facts. Okay. You needed an excavation to be undertaken under the directions of the Allahabad High Court to prove that there was indeed a temple underneath the disputed structure. Okay. You don't need that as far as Kashi is concerned because you can see the temple right in front of your eyes.
Right.
Okay. You can see the temple structure. Okay. That's point number one. Point number two, the Krishna Janmabhoomi movement is equally active and it is waiting for, let's say, a political organization or a mass organization to pick it up and understand its value. Because I don't think anybody is going to argue that Krishna Janmabhoomi is less important than Ram Janmabhoomi or Kashi Vishwanath is any less important. Kashi is the oldest city known to human civilization and it represents the epicenter of the Hindu civilization, according to me. So, as far as I am concerned, both these issues are equally important. What is it that people can do is the civil society can try and create more information and more knowledge about these facts, because I think over the last 5 or 10 years, or at least over the last 5 years, what has come about is the power of WhatsApp, the power of memes, the power of videos has an impact. And ultimately, look at your own portal, Op India. Whatever you report has managed to reach the portals of the parliament, the floor of the parliament, when somebody finds that it has a significant amount of political value and it is backed by credible facts. Okay. So I think the first thing that perhaps Hindus need to do is to start establishing a case based on facts. However, there is a via media which is possible, and this is something that I hinted at on a Rajya Sabha TV debate, which is the Allahabad High Court ordered the excavation of the site in 2003. Okay. And once the ASI report made it abundantly clear that there was a temple underneath the disputed structure, the tide had turned in favor of the Hindus because they were bandied as, let's say, liars of the first order and as having concocted and manufactured history. But the moment the findings became public, people understood that there was more to it than meets the eye. Okay. Similarly, at the very least, it is possible to move the court or to move the government to simply order excavation in some of these sites. Before you even consider repealing the legislation, before you even consider giving back those sites to the original claimants, at the very least, you order excavation at those sites so that the claim of these communities, which is to say that there used to be a Hindu temple, is verified. And once it is placed before the court of public opinion, let the public decide, is it possible that in all these 40,000 places or 50,000 places, the temples to demolish before somebody could build their place of worship? Could it have just happened out of thin air, or is there more to it than meets the eye? So what I said was, the moment you finish an excavation, a basic preliminary excavation, and that excavation reveals that there is a non-Islamic structure and there is a Hindu architecture or Hindu temple underneath that particular structure, then I think it serves as a fantastic starting point, because then the onus shifts to the other side to explain its conduct and why we must not ask for reclamation of those places.
Something you said struck me. Aside from the excavation, you said that this was in the beginning of the discussion where you said that the act was actually implemented before the illegal structure was demolished by Karsevaks. Now, explain this to me, not just from a legal point of view, but from how perhaps the state functions. Now, in my mind, as somebody who is a Hindu and who has her faith in Lord Ram and the Ram Janmabhoomi, when the state itself says that from here on, you have absolutely no right and nobody is going to listen to your grievances and legitimate concerns as far as your places of worship are concerned, do you think the state uh, takes away even legal rights from Hindus, but sort of rewards minorities and especially the Muslim community for their street veto power? So, in my mind, I think Ram Janmabhoomi was the movement was the first time Hindus showed that they are capable of implementing street veto power. Okay.
Right. Right.
And when I see how the state functions, it almost seems like the state rewards the Muslim community for their power of street veto, while at the same time taking away even legal rights from the Hindus and assuming that the Hindu community is going to keep quiet and just accept whatever is being done to them. So this fundamental flaw in how the state functions and in how the laws function, of course with respect to places of worship act, but even generally, so how do Hindus really address this issue as going forward, especially when we are talking about thousands of temples that have been desecrated and illegal structures have been built on it?
I think you have raised an important question, and let me draw from your report on the CA riots. Okay, the scintillating report that you have put out on, because you see, the justification that some of these culprits and perpetrators of those riots have given is that first you abrogated or you watered down Article 370, then you
Yeah.
came out with the Ayodhya verdict, you took away our masjid, okay, and subsequently you decided to come out with the CAA. Now there is talk of NRC. All of this justifies our wanton act of destruction, okay. Now let's take a look at a couple of events before the 6th of December 1992. Okay, the Shah Bano decision came out in 1985.
Yeah.
Hindus started facing radicalism and extreme aggression in the valley from 1989, in the Kashmir valley from 1989 at the very least. Then in January 1990, they were kicked out of the valley.
Oh,
Sorry?
you're Hindu. Sorry. Continue.
Right?
Huh.
So Hindus started facing aggression and they were kicked out of the valley in January 1990. Right? Then the Narasimha Rao government comes to power in July 1991. Okay? Sorry, in June 1991. And within a couple of, let's say, 3 to 4 months, they decide to come out with the Places of Worship Act of 1991. Okay? So what is it that the people who were fighting for the Ram Janmabhoomi perceived? That it's not just about Ram Janmabhoomi, but the Hindu is effectively at the receiving end of the state's legislative power across the board, and the Indian state has proven to be a soft state in guaranteeing the basic safety of the Hindu in the Kashmir Valley. Okay, so if people want to justify the riots of Delhi in one particular manner, then they must ask themselves, what if people decide to justify the 6th of December 1992, citing everything that happened between 85 and 92? Okay, so that's one. Two, I do believe that effectively nothing has changed for the better on the ground when it comes to limiting the street veto of the radical Islamist. Okay, and the presence of any government is no guarantee for Hindu safety, and Bangalore is a living example of that, is a direct example of that.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I would say that perhaps Sri Yogi's government in Uttar Pradesh has been a sterling exception to that particular rule, that when people decided to go on a rampage in Aligarh and other places, he swiftly decided to give them a taste of how law enforcement is supposed to work in a civilized country where people are not allowed to go about destroying public property in the name of any grievance. Okay? So I do believe that the Indian state, to a significant extent, has rewarded street veto, not in all circumstances, but street veto which is directed at the majority community. That is something that has happened very, very often. And Mr. Narasimha Rao, who is frequently credited as being an exception to the Congress's brand of secularism, was the one who ultimately brought about this particular legislation, which effectively foreclosed options for 30,000 or 39,000 temples, right? So I believe that we must be very, very careful in glorifying and putting someone on a pedestal. Mr. Rao may be an exception to the standard brand of the Congress in some ways, but he was a congressman after all when it comes to these issues. Okay, so I do believe that the the Indian state needs to set the balance right and needs to do justice to Hindu interests. And it can start doing so by doing this. But there is something else you must actually even consider. For a moment, let's forget all these claims which are centuries old. I'm not asking you to give it up. But what about those temples which were destroyed in living memory in modern Indian Republic, in Kashmir, in Uttar
Yes.
Pradesh, under the Samajwadi government and every other government?
Hmm.
On a regular basis, you would see attacks. You would see Veda Patashalas being set on fire in places like Mao,
Hmm.
okay, in Uttar Pradesh. And in Kashmir, the government came out with a report, I think in 2014, after this government's coming into power, that close to 600 temples were demolished in Kashmir, in independent India. So those temples which have been demolished in living memory and which have
Hmm.
been converted into public conveniences, at the very least, let's start with that. Once you do that, you will at least have the civilizational confidence to basically say, this has been your conduct in modern, independent Republic of India with complete media clear, with the ability to record and archive everything. Are you telling me that you were not capable of doing this 500 or 600 years ago? That's something that the public is not going to buy. So if the government really wants to make a case for repealment of the Places of Worship Act, let it start by rebuilding those places of worship which have been demolished in Kashmir and other parts of the country in the first place. And once that happens, you can think of actually aiming for these sites. Until then, according to me, it's a pipe dream. There is a living community, there is a living civilization that's being kicked out of its land, and it doesn't even have access to its own places of worship in modern independent India. We are not talking of the medieval period.
So, what do you think stopped the state from doing this? I mean, is it the fear of the Muslim street veto? Because I'm trying to understand everything, in conversation, when you and I are talking, everything seems really easy. The legal route is to get rid of Places of Worship Act. The other way is to start the excavation of these Hindu sacred places which were usurped by invaders. The other method is to start rebuilding temples and sacred areas which were Hindus but were demolished or desecrated in modern India. For example, the sacred places of the Kashmiri Hindus in the Kashmir Valley. But somehow, none of this really happens. And
Right.
at least in, as far as we can see, I don't see these things really moving along too quickly. And not no Hindu really has the faith in any government to pick up these issues and run with it. If I'm asked today, do I have blind faith that the Modi government is going to take this step in repealing this act? I'm going to probably say no, and I'm probably never going to have that confidence in any government, whether it's the Modi government or any other government, because a nagging thought is there, that the state has never done what it's supposed to do and what it's meant to do, when it's the question of looking after Hindu rights. So, what is it that stops the state? It's not the legality of it, it's not the logistics of it, it's not difficulty in implementation. So, what is it? Is it the fear of the Muslim street veto? And is it that thought that, look, we did one small thing, which is bringing out a law that will give citizenship, expedite citizenship for persecuted Hindus from Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan. And, most of the country burnt for weeks. What if we were to do this? How much of it would burn? Do you think this question is the eternal fear that stops the state from, doing right by the Hindus?
I think there are two terminals to this particular question. One is from the standpoint of the government, and one is from the standpoint of the Hindu society. Okay. In my limited opinion, it would be perhaps simplistic to assume that the issue is fairly straightforward, because the government will have to deal with at least two or three external implications of it. One, most governments, at least under the Congress dispensation and the Nehruvian dispensation, they were always worried about the decisions that might be taken by the Organization of Islamic Countries against India. Okay. And how it would affect our oil imports. That's a question that India has to necessarily deal with. Three, what kind of global and Indian nexus in terms of religious nexus would it lead to, translating to greater radicalization than we are already dealing with? This is something that the government is entitled to consider and has to legitimately consider. Okay,
And so
I
you're
don't.
saying that these steps are taking, the government has to consider whether it would lead to greater radicalization in the Muslim community. That's what you said, if I got you correctly.
Absolutely. One is radicalization and a greater window for external actors to interfere with Indian politics and Indian
Right.
situation. Okay. And unfortunately, since some groups effectively think at a global level and we think at the national level, that is the reality that we have to face. Because some people effectively see themselves as part of a global majority, not as part of an Indian minority. While they play the minority card as far as Indian government is concerned, they are effectively a global
Part
majority.
of Ummah.
Ummah, whatever you call it. Okay, so that's one. So the government is not entirely wrong in having to think of all this. See, if I have a pet peeve, I'm bound to look at that issue only in isolation. And I don't have access to all the variables and all the issues that a government will have to deal with and consider before taking a decision. The issue is clear, the position is clear. The question is of the path you have to take to arrive at that particular destination, which is fraught with a lot of ifs and buts. Okay, so we have to strike a distinction between the legitimacy of the cause and your capacity to reach that particular destination. And that's a question of, let's say, both resources, political heft, diplomatic heft, and whatnot. Now, I think our fear that we will stand to be isolated and we will effectively lose out on oil and everything else and imports and investment and all that, I think is belied by the fact that our neighbor on the, let's say, on the northeast is getting away with everything under the sun. Okay. And he has managed to establish that the only thing that matters as far as the rest of the world is concerned is either you have the market or you have the manufacturing ability or you have the investment ability. So money is the only thing that matters to the mercantile powers of the West. Okay. And if you have the West by your side and you're in a position to effectively pamper those interests or accommodate those interests, you can practically get away with any kind of decision that you take. I'm not saying any kind of human rights abuse, but legitimate decisions. Okay.
No, but did we face any sort of backlash as far as CA was concerned? I mean, of course, there was backlash. The Islamic organization of those, the
But there have
group.
been no economic consequences either from the Middle East or the rest of the world at all, right?
No,
Tangibly,
so
there has
there
been no
were
economic.
no tangible repercussions to us
Correct,
taking the decision to implement CAA. There were
correct,
no tangible implications of the Bhumi Pujan of Ram Janmabhoomi. I mean, if you look back 10 years or 20 years, I would imagine the reaction would be extremely different from
correct,
just a few, absolutely crazy and stupid op-eds on the
right,
New York Times and Washington Post, etc. So
right,
clearly, India has reached a position where it can look after its civilizational interests
right,
without really worrying about the global community and without really worrying about tangible repercussions from the global community.
right,
So,
right.
after this test run, after CA and after Ram Janmabhoomi, at this point of time, now where India stands, what is holding us back or what could hold us back?
See, be it Ram Janmabhoomi or the CA or 370, I would say they were fairly decent successes, but there is still a significant void that needs to be addressed. One, the government needs to develop a thicker skin in terms of international reactions to decisions which are taken in civilizational interest. At the
Hmm.
same time, the government must up its PR ante and have its A game ready whenever it takes these decisions so that it is in a position to say, I am not going to cover under, let's say, the browbeating of a New York Times or a Washington Post or a Huffington Post or whatever post it may be. I have my responses ready, but I am not going to wait for your validation for my decisions because at the end of the day, this is a civilization that finally is asserting its place under the sun and is saying that I deserve a place of respect and I deserve to take back those places which belong to me, at the very least, those which define my civilizational identity. Point number two was the terminal of the Hindu society. And this is where I think I will need to address some of the points which are made in earlier discussions,
Hmm.
which is the Hindu society, which is completely dependent on the state to protect its interests, will always find itself being kicked around by political expediency and political interests. Okay. The strength of other communities is the societal and institutional autonomy that they enjoy, which gives them the ability to lobby for their interests and to oil the machinery wherever it needs to be in order for their interest to be presented before the right places, so that they find political lobbies and they find lobbies in the media. So when a society surrenders its entire civilizational interest at the hands of one political organization in the hope that they will effectively lead to a deliverance and liberation, so to speak, then you have decided to invest all your eggs in one basket. A Hindu society which lacks a sense of community, which lacks institutional autonomy and institutional strength, will never be in a position to create a political incentive. Okay? Perhaps that was possible at a time in the 1980s and the 1990s when the general population was much more devout and which was much more connected to its traditions. But given the new urban chic, deracinated Hindu that we are now used to, okay, who doesn't know beyond saying that, oh, Persians were the ones who gave us the name Hindu, beyond that they know nothing of Hindu history, about Hindu knowledge, or whatever it may be. When these people effectively decide to occupy center stage, then they forget that what ultimately delivers the goods is societal strength, which converts to political pressure. Otherwise, it has really no value. And it is always a better situation when the society is in a much better position to look after its own interests, even independent of political interests. Let me give you a direct and a very politically incorrect example. If you go to Kerala, several groups are in a position to run an economy, a self-contained, self-sustained economy, independent of the government or independent of, let's say, Hindu groups. They don't need Hindu customers, they don't need Hindu buyers, they don't need anybody at all, and they're in a position to run a parallel economy completely, right? From hospitals to malls to educational institutions, all services to residential complexes and communities and whatnot. Okay? Such a community is bound to be in a much better position to dictate terms to others. But if you constantly cede your entire space at the feet of the government or a political organization, you will never be in a position to independently assert your interests vocally. That is something that we seem to constantly forget. At the drop of a hat and at the first given opportunity, we are more than happy to surrender all interests at the feet of a political organization, as opposed to using a political organization as a conduit for deliverance of civilizational goals.
So, this is very interesting. So, a lot of people on social media and otherwise keep talking about this non-left ecosystem that we are supposedly failing to make.
Right.
Now, it's very interesting you said this, because I think I've always believed that an ecosystem which if is rooted in civilizational interests of a people has to
Right.
be built independent of a political party, because you don't
Right.
know which political party you will have to fight at which
Right.
point of time to protect your own interests and your community's interests.
Right.
So what you are saying is that there are two aspects to this and two reasons why at this point in time these decisions are not being sort of moving forward. One is that the Hindu society has not been able to really organize itself and assert their electoral might as far as bargaining for their civilizational interests are concerned. Essentially saying that these are our demands and we will vote for a party that will try and fulfill our demands, essentially making it politically lucrative for
Correct.
any party to meet the Hindu needs. And secondly, because no government in power has managed to garner the mental and psychological strength to say get lost to whoever sort of stands in the way of implementation of policy or rules or regulations or laws which will look after the Hindu rights. Is that what you're saying? That these are the only two things which are standing in our way?
You're completely right. And here I'll give you perhaps a very tangible point. See, here's the thing. The thing about democracy is that an elected government has to constantly firefight on a daily basis to stay in power. Okay? It has to deal with internal rivalry, internal factionalism, and whatnot. Okay? And it has to constantly fend off its external detractors as well, within the country and outside the country. Okay? And a political party is primarily a political creature. I think it's as obvious a statement as it can get. So if you effectively expect such an organization, which is firefighting 24/7 and has to deal with headlines on a daily basis from either the Indian Express or the Hindu or the Times of India or the Scroll or the Wire or Swarajya or Up India or anybody else, okay, you don't expect them to have the bandwidth or the patience for your civilizational goals, because the civilization goal is always long term. You're looking at least 15 years, 20 years, 25 years. A political party is looking at survival at best for 5 years and 10 years and not beyond. You're not a Communist Party of China, which doesn't have any competition, which has the luxury of coming out with a 100-year vision or a 200-year vision. Your lifetime is as good as the next election cycle, and you never know. It's like the let's say the release of the movie every Friday. You're as good as the next release, right? So in such a setup, it is for the society to come out with institutions which secure its long-term interests, and ultimately this audience will gradually put pressure on the government to take civilization goals seriously until you reach that ideal situation where the government knows that the only thing that will satisfy its core base is a civilizational decision, not a myopic political decision. We are far from that particular ideal situation. Okay. Therefore, if the society believes that its job is done the moment it has pressed the button on any particular sign, then that society has set itself up for destruction and suicide, because you're faced with those people and you're faced with those kind of adversaries who are vastly better prepared and independent of any ecosystem. For a moment, let us assume that the Indian state, that is the union government as well as the state governments, decide to stop all schemes for minority benefits. Even then, it would not affect the minorities in any way, because they have resources which are independent of the Indian state's resources. That is not the case as far as the Indian Hindu society is concerned. Okay, your core resources, which are your institutions, are in the hands of the state, and you constantly bring up issues like caste and whatnot to effectively say that no, the government should still continue to be in these institutions. You don't have the wherewithal, or you don't have the originality to create those institutions which are completely independent of state dependence, so that you can start dictating the terms. So I think you've hit the nail on the head, which is that a political party, I'm not saying it in a negative sense. If you have to survive in the politics of today, you have to firefight on a regular basis. So you can't constantly go to them and say that I want you to take a decision in civilizational interest. You can't beg. You have to be in a position to effectively dictate terms. That can't happen unless and until you're self-sufficient. Today, you're not. And the worst part is, I don't think the core thought leaders of the Hindu community are even thinking on the lines of self-sufficiency of the community.
Interestingly, but you say that the government is always on firefighting mode. However, Congress managed to do this beautifully. It managed to empower institutions that will
It is
fight
great to
happening wrongs against Congress also, if they think that their liberal goals are not being met. And while they fight, 2 days later, they'll be sipping wine and having beef together at some posh party. So I think Congress managed to do this really well. I think it's the culture of BJP and RSS which is not really allowing them to move past and create this,
No, in
these
fact, let me
structures.
address this argument straight off. In fact, I just see a comment which says that Sai's argument doesn't hold water. How did the Congress change textbooks and implement RT so quickly? Fantastic. Let me give you an answer. The Congress decided to set up a Rajiv Gandhi Foundation. The Congress decided to set up institutions which were basic, the NAC, the National Advisory Council. The Congress effectively decided to cultivate the left ecosystem and decided to create a symbiotic relationship, effectively saying, I will effectively wield power and you please take care of the academic strongholds and the policy strongholds. And that symbiotic relationship is the reason why the Congress continued in power, whereas policy-making institutions were in the hands of the left. Otherwise, how do you explain operational hijacking of, let's say, MHRD department by cultural Marxists during the Congress period? Because the Congress effectively decided that one person will handle the ideological aspects of it and influence gateways of information and gateways of, let's say, knowledge dissemination, whereas we will handle power. So there was at least a fantastic relationship of outsourcing and delegation, where one takes care of power, the other takes care of ideology, and there is sufficient investment in individuals and institutions who will come out with policy recommendations. Today,
That's how the communal right bill came along, right?
exactly, the communal right bill or the superstition, the legislation against superstitions and rationalism and whatnot, the RT, all of this is not the product of a political party. It's the product of a political party's realization in investing in intellectuals and in investing in creating an intellectual base. Okay, so that symbiotic relationship, the Congress cracked it. See, let's be fair as well. The Congress had close to 70 years to make as many mistakes as possible and revise its strategy. I'm not saying that the BJP, which has effectively been in power from 98 to 2004, 2014 to 2020, that's the cumulative period, right? Not beyond that. I have no disagreements. However, if you've cracked the code of defeating these people at elections and still these people constantly torment you through other platforms without ever being in power, then they have done something which you still fail to learn and understand from. Okay? If somebody tells me that political victory alone is sufficient to ensure civilizational interests and secure civilizational interests, I must effectively say, I pity you. I'm grateful to you for your interaction. I have nothing more to say. Then you've really not read history. You don't know what has happened over the last 73 years at all. Okay? Independent of the Congress, you have a Romila Thapar, you have an Irfan Habib, you have an Arash, who have been the recipients of investment, strategic investment. Okay? So assume for a moment that a political party of the non-left, let's say hue, is interested only in securing its political interests. I am saying you forget civilizational interests. I am saying you forget civilizational interest as a political party altogether. You don't worry about it. It is still in your political interest to ensure that the core vote base remains both in demographics as well as in influence, because these are the only people who will come back to vote for you again. Nobody else is going to vote for you again, right? Those people who are under the thrall of the leftist ecosystem will never vote for you under any circumstances, right? And the space for voices which are pro non-left, so to speak, has still been shrinking. It's not exactly expanding. It is expanding in certain other places, but in certain other places, there is greater hounding and persecution of such non-left voices, right? So the government, or let's say a political party with a political interest, can still think of civilizational interest from a strategic perspective. You don't need to be purely ideological about it. If you tell me that there is no political incentive to investment in an intellectual ecosystem or in a civilizational ecosystem, then I really don't know what is the point of having this discussion with you. Then you're always going to be outflanked and outmaneuvered by someone who has understood the value of an ecosystem much better than you and who's reaping the benefits of it on a daily basis.
Sai, in my view, there are two aspects to this. Not just building the intellectual, ecosystem, but the intellectual ecosystem sort of formulates policy suggestions out of whatever is the popular consensus.
Right.
And the popular consensus is built by whether the South Delhi, South Bombay crowd agrees or not. But a majority of the popular consensus is built by ground karyakartas from that of Bajrang Dal, VHP, Durga Vahini, Hindu Vahini, etc. We have seen a systematic defanging of grassroots level Hindu organizations like VHP and Bajrang Dal through the decades. Absolutely through the decades since the beginning, we have seen a systematic defanging of these institutions. In fact, I have said this a lot of times, that when a Hindu is in trouble, no white collar politician is going to come to your aid. It is the ground level karyakarta of Bajrang Dal and VHP who is going to come and stand by you and tell you that nobody is going to touch you before going through them. So how do we okay, we understand that the intellectual ecosystem takes time to build. Congress had 70 years. BJP has had only, 7 to 10 years, 11, 12 years. How do we solve this issue of defanging these Hindu institutions which have worked at the grassroots level for so many decades? And how do you empower them again to start building that ground consensus again?
See, there is a point when you have to admit that you have run out of excuses. And I'll tell you where. Okay, you can't seem to influence the South Delhi crowd, the South Bombay crowd, or the South Calcutta crowd, because you see, these are all English educated people. They managed to create a Kanhaiya Kumar who speaks in Hindi. What are you really talking about? Right? They managed to create a Kanhaiya Kumar at JNU who speaks in Hindi and who seems to hold some kind of a sway, at least as far as education institutions are concerned. I am not saying that when it comes to an intellectual ecosystem, I am not speaking of English-speaking people. That's not my intention at all. I am not even going to make the statement that intellectualism means being able to string a pentasyllabic sentence in English. That's not my point at all. I'm merely saying investment in hardcore resources in vernacular languages. Is it really difficult to think of creating 5 ambassadors in each state who represent the Indic ecosystem in each of those states, who are capable of reaching out to their domestic audience in either Tamil, Telugu, English, Hindi, whatnot? I'm not even referring to English, because English is spoken by a minuscule minority in this country. Even English news doesn't really make much of a difference. English news is primarily consumed only by bureaucrats and by judges and by a couple of other people. But most people read, the average person reads Hindi, or let's say the local newspaper, much more than any other newspaper. That's a fact. Okay. So even assume for a moment that the intellectual ecosystem created by the left, which dominates the South Delhi crowd, is something that you will never be touched by. They treat you as people who they don't wish to engage with. I would ask myself this simple question: have you succeeded in creating a street veto? No. So neither have you succeeded in creating an intellectual veto, nor have you succeeded in creating an intellectual street veto, and you continue to give me excuses to say, no, he must be doing something different. Please tell me this. You don't have the response to the jihadi radical who goes about burning streets on a regular basis and who decides to whip up passions at will and is effectively now threatening even the life and safety of security agencies, of law enforcement agencies. Okay, you don't seem to have the response even to intellectuals who are in a position to create a controversy willy-nilly at the drop of a hat through one article or one headline. Okay. So what is it that you think you have actually achieved when it comes to shutting these people up through legitimate means and with preparation? See, I can understand if I'm some party pooper who constantly has this dying need to find mistakes with you. But I'm sorry, I'm looking at the facts in front of me. Bangalore, after Mumbai, is one of the economic hubs of this country. Okay, the kind of investment and revenue that Bangalore alone generates is huge. Okay. Several states in this country can perhaps run on the economy, let's say, churned out by Bangalore. And that particular city is brought to a grinding halt within a matter of a couple of hours. What kind of coordination is this? Right?
Yeah.
So one is a question of, tell me that you have succeeded at least on one front. If it's only winning at elections, then after elections, what has it translated to? Has it translated to putting an end to this nonsense? No, you still remain a soft state. Now, second, see, the urban Hindu who believes in both Buddhism and who believes in polytheism and who hates caste and who sits in Mumbai, okay, can always talk about, no, Hinduism is full of diversity. Hinduism is all about mouthing platitudes. Hinduism is all about, let's say, love, tolerance, peace, and all that. Kindly tell me that these platitudes will shut the radical jihadi when he turns up with a mob outside your home. That's not going to happen. Okay. One, because you don't have the wherewithal to individually take him on. Second, you don't have a sense of community or an institution which will come to your aid immediately. You might as well give up on the police, because the police themselves shit bricks in their pants the moment they are faced with the crowd, because they know that even if they have, no, I'm not saying that they can't take up the jihadi.
No,
I'm basically
they don't have the permission, as in they are absolutely
the point. It's not as if the police is incapable of actually shutting. See, let's look at this very, very clearly. The same police functions differently under Yogi Ji and under previous dispensations. Okay. Yeah. So it's not a question of guts. It's not a question of lack of spine. Their only concern is, we will take the right decision, which is in the interest of the public. But tomorrow, will you protect us from all these people who will write 1,000 different editorials against us, who will vilify us, and who will hound us for us having done our jobs? That's the basic question. Okay. So the state apparatus is effectively held ransom to other interests. Okay. You don't have institutions. You don't have street veto. You don't have intellectual veto. What are you left with? Oh, once in 5 years, we succeed in elections. Thank you. Thank you. You have secured your interests.
No, we are tolerant.
We are very tolerant. You see, we are all... And we will turn the other cheek, and we'll continue to sell this unique creature called soft power, because all we believe is only soft power. Whereas street veto will continuously reinforce the importance of hard power, and we will continue to sell soft power. We can't seem to save Hinduism in India, but we will sell Hinduism in Latin America and in other countries. So that is the goal. I
have a joke on that, which I'll tell you personally later, once you're not live. But the question still remains, what do we do to empower organizations like VHP and Bajrang Dal? Because in my mind, and I know I'm going to get a lot of hate for this, if this actually, if people are watching this who are not non-left, but in my mind, the most important institutions for Hindus in today's day and age, after you've seen the havoc that was created during the Delhi riots, during the Bangalore riots, and so on and so forth, endlessly, one cycle after the next. Before that, it was Kamlesh Tiwari. So, one cycle after the next, the kind of havoc that is being created, in my mind, the two organizations that comes to mind, and other organizations which are similar to these organizations, are VHP and Bajrang Dal. Now, every government in power has sort of worked towards defanging these organizations which actually work on the ground and which build consensus amongst the Hindus, which build a community spirit amongst the Hindus. And let's be honest, they are muscle. They
Right.
help us have the confidence that if there are jihadis in front of my door tomorrow, I have somebody to pick up the call, pick up the phone and call that, listen, I'm in trouble, can you please help me? No white collar politician is going to do that. So how do we really empower them again, independent of the state? Because I have lost, I don't know where to look. We have to look within, and we have to look within the community.
See, without naming any particular organization, let me simply highlight the fact that today, I think in Kerala, the Adi Shankara statue was desecrated and defied with the flag of, I think, SDPI or PFI, one of these two organizations.
No, that case turned out to be something different. So let's choose a separate example, because in that case, apparently, it was a drunk fellow called. I mean, that's what the police is saying now, that it was a drunk fellow called Milind who had just put the
Fair
flag
enough.
on
Okay.
top of the
I'll take back that example. I withdraw that particular example.
Yeah.
Processions were taken out, recalling the Mopla riots in the aftermath of the CAA in Kerala.
Yes.
Okay. And slogans were effectively raised to the effect of saying, we have not thrown away our swords in the Arabian Sea. We have not forgotten what has happened. Please, remember and don't forget the Mapila riots. That's effectively the sentiment that was echoed. Okay. Name one action that was taken against these people by any apparatus of the state. Nobody has taken action against them. And that's effectively an open threat to those people who were victims of the Mapla riots, which is Hindus and nobody else.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, I have to ask myself this simple question. If the state is not in a position to respond to this kind of an open threat, okay, what options are you leaving me with? Then at the very least, the one question that I have to ask is, can you consider a better or a revised version of the Arms Act? Okay.
Yeah.
Something that was discussed in the background of the Kokrajhar riots in 2012, when Hindu tribals were effectively being massacred by jihadis. Okay.
You're talking about the right to bear arms, basically.
Correct. So there are other jurisdictions which seem to be talking about the right to bear arms. And here, whether you like it or not, the antisocial elements and the anti-Hindu elements are always better equipped with arms compared to the Hindu community. So neither do we have the arms to protect us, nor do we have
comparison. There is just no comparison. And
no
Delhi
comparison.
riots sort of proved that beyond, any.
You are outgunned for all practical purposes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So slowly you're pushing Hindus to consider a point where they have to ask themselves, even under this government, if we are this unsafe, what are the options left to us? Not to engage in, let's say, esoteric civilization discussions, but to protect our safety, our livelihood, our people, our property, our dignities. That's the basic question. Okay. Civilization is meaningless unless and until you can guarantee the dignity of a person. Okay. And the safety of a person. That's the basic thing. So perhaps, as you said, some of these organizations will prove themselves to be relevant, and perhaps public sentiment will push for greater participation of these organizations if the state and the government is not in a position to guarantee what is expected of them, which is safety and a life of dignity.
So I've covered so many cases where the victims of jihadi violence, their standard line is कि हाँ हमारे पास इस संस्था से लोग आए थे, उस संस्था से लोग आए थे, VHP से आए थे, बजरंग दल से आए थे, और सिर्फ वही आते हैं समय के वक्त, जब जरूरत पड़ती है तो यही लोग आते हैं बचाने के लिए. And I have absolutely no qualms in saying that these organizations and many such organizations like these have to be empowered. I'm not saying that there should be violence. But if push comes to shove, you need to know that there are people in your corner to protect you and protect your dignity and right to life and right to property,
Right.
and ensure your safety from the crazed mobs that seem to get offended at the drop of a hat.
Right.
Now, I think we've made up for the time lost when Arvindan ji, we couldn't hear Arvindan ji. And hopefully, we'll continue this discussion in a much more structured manner later, Sai.
Right.
Yeah? But you have to
Yeah.
promise us that you'll come back soon. Otherwise, we'll continue this for another hour.
No, no, of course we will. And I think the discussion with Arvindan is very, very critical because it ties into the discussions that we just had with respect to creating a societal institution or institutional strength. So, unless and until we have a frank discussion on caste related issues and caste based institutions, it's impossible to address this entire issue of what is it that we mean by societal security and societal self sufficiency on matters of safety. Okay, what is it that when we say that we need institutions that can think of civilization, what would be the identity of those institutions, what will be the composition of these institutions? Because you see, we have to address this another issue: Hindu unity, the project to unify all Hindus by killing the caste identity. That is something that I think we need to address.
Great. So hopefully we will be able to get Arvindanji on the podcast soon to discuss these issues. And I'm going to try and keep getting Sai periodically, even though I have to really threaten him and throw a massive tantrum for a few days before he finds the time. But I'll continue to do that, and we'll try and get more people, and so we can have open and frank discussions as to what needs to be done further. So thank you for being patient initially, and thank you for being with us. And we'll see you soon again.
Thank you, Nupur. Bye.